This is just we just wanted to allow some connections today and to at least start the conversation. So good afternoon. We thank you for making yourselves available to us. I know you all are busy, but I think that this important dialogue in particular to talk about how you can be change agents and empowering agents for our students and even for your coworkers within our respective communities is huge. So again, we know that this is something that you may have some entry points in that are different for each of you. And so we just want to acknowledge that. Again, my name is Joseph Colón. I'm the director for the Office of Multicultural Affairs. My pronouns are he, him, his. And Emily is going to introduce herself fairly quickly, and then we'll get right into it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Hickey. I also work in the Office of Multicultural Affairs. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers, and my role within Multicultural Affairs is to lead diversity education efforts and support all international students at Hopkins. I've been here for about a minute, so I'm still, I joined the team in August, so I still have a lot to learn in terms of context specific to Hopkins, but I've been doing diversity education work for about 10 years. And I'm really excited that we're having this conversation. It's very appropriate right now and necessary.
So welcome to the Racial Justice Dialogue, Allyship and Advocate series for staff. Well, just to kind of give you some context, we actually just did this with our students, and we had such great conversation from a student perspective. So now it's your turn. They were very active, so my hope is that you are also active. So last week, the diversity and inclusion team called upon us to the community at large to share their feelings, thoughts, fears, and frustrations about the recent deaths at the hands of police violence. And so we thought it appropriate to continue the conversation. And the Hopkins community is at a crossroads right now. Our students are finding their voices, they're activating their activism. We must, hear and find ways to effectively support them. So today's focus will look at having a dialogue around allyship and advocacy. We know that any progress needs a collectivist approach. So supporting our students of color and especially our Black students during this time is our focus. We must also look to those people of color and non-Black allies to be active and engaged in work authentically, critically, and confidently. Today is going to be part of a presentation. It's going to be part presentation and part dialogue, mostly dialogue. That's what we aspire for it to be. And our ask of you is to be active within this conversation. Be vulnerable, be challenged, be charged, stay active, and think about your role in being an effective ally. So in this short 1 hour dialogue, this is a starter for future engagement strategies within the D&I team umbrella. So we need your engagement, involvement, expertise, ideas for our deeper dive into understanding the systemic oppression that's pervasive in many of our lives. So what's on the agenda for today? Quite simply, a lot. And so we really struggled with this because we wanted to do more. So we vowed to do more. To continue this conversation. So the first thing we're going to do is obviously talk about barriers to allyship. We're going to talk a little about defining systemic racism, talk about intent versus impact, allyship as a core principle and definition. We'll have some common questions surrounding allyship that might pop up, advocacy and action, racial justice, strategies, and open dialogue. We have in the chat, folks have asked and requested, and thank you. If you could mute your microphone, that'd be great. And thank you for that. I appreciate it. So before we dive in, I'm going to ask you to do something fun. If you could take out your cell phones or even use your internet, as that's what we're doing now. Before we dive in, I would like to have you respond to a specific question. And so this is through poll area. And I want to know, using one-word descriptors. Again, you can enter as many times as you want, but what are some feelings, what are some barriers around engaging effective allyship and advocacy? What do you think are some of those things? Now, this will be a word cloud, and we'll be able to see this real time. So please enter.
Mistakes, fear, uncertainty, which can lead to fear. Lack of knowledge. Definitely. That's a big one. Hopelessness, fatigue, absolutely. Offending folks, political correctness, absolutely. This is like a test for me to catch up. I saw someone put imposter syndrome, definitely. Offensive, yep. Overwhelmed, inadequate. We're coming up with words very quickly. Closed-mindedness, definitely. Yeah. So just in the last 30 seconds, we were able to come up with all of these different barriers or feelings centered around allyship and advocacy. So it's a very complicated, many-layered conversation. Thank you all for participating. Ignorance, acceptance.
Emily, the words are not popping up on your screen.
Oh, no one else is seeing this? But
no. Yep.
Oh,
so thank you for reading them out loud.
Yeah. All right. So some of the things that I'm seeing is, inexpertise, judgment, fear and offending, privilege, misunderstanding, lack of vulnerability, judgment, some performativeness, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, definitely. Lack of understanding, ego. There's one. Absolutely. Well, I'm so sorry that you all can't see this word cloud. Hopefully it'll be on the recording, but I think, what I saw from my end is words started popping up very quickly.
If you don't mind, we could actually, I can use my screen and share it fairly quickly and then be able to do that. Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
So I am going to
go for it.
Go for it.
Plan B. I was the only one that was impressed then at how quickly.
I think I can't because of my my association, so it's just I need to be a host.
Okay. Well, we can keep.
Try to refresh your screen. That's what Deborah says.
Okay. Can you all still see my screen? Give me a little thumbs up if you can. Okay, beautiful. This is the world we're in right now. Are you able to see the words yet?
Nope.
Nope. Okay.
So we'll just continue. We'll share with you what that word cloud looks like, and we'll leave it and make sure that we want to make sure we're staying true to time. So thank you for providing that word cloud for us. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to switch over and hand it over to Emily, who's going to go on to the next few slides.
So one of the big reasons why we wanted to facilitate this conversation right now is particularly with the pain and the struggle and the suffering that's happening in our country. And, a lot of that is rooted in white supremacy. A lot of that is rooted in systemic racism. And so I want us just to take a moment before we enter into this conversation about true allyship and advocacy. And I want us to think about the system in itself, right? And maybe even shifting some of that narrative of the system being broken and thinking about it more from a deeper, more beginning sense of the system being built that way. And so as we talk about allyship and advocacy, we need to have an understanding of what those roots look like. We need to know where they intersect. We need to know what is under the umbrella. And we need to know about the impact that they have on individuals and communities. So when we think about systemic racism, it's a very big, many-layered system. It intersects with policies, laws, rules and social norms, even hidden rules, right? The things that are never written down anywhere, but folks are expected to follow. And most specifically, systemic racism advantages white folks or white passing folks, right? It's not necessarily just about the identities that you yourself hold. It's about how other folks perceive perceive you to be, to specifically disadvantaged communities of color. So the list that I have on my screen here is a short one for a very, very big problem. And so, you know, we have racial profiling and policing. This can happen with law enforcement. This can happen at the airport. It can even happen in employment, hiring, and advancement, right? Racial profiling and associating stereotypes. Like, systemic racism is interwoven into so many pieces of our everyday lives. From our healthcare to the access we have to politicians, right? Even getting our voices heard right now, there might be plenty of barriers to us to be able to do that. You know, so given how big this conversation is and how many folks are here, I kind of just wanted to touch base with folks and see what's missing from this list that's important for you, that's important for us to bring up in this conversation. And so I'll ask you just to kind of add some of your ideas to the chat so that we can continue expanding this list and our understanding of just how far racism has gone into our systems. So feel welcome to add them into the chat. So something that I think about often is, you know, we're in an academic setting. I think about research and the populations that are being researched and having access to this research, and how much research can inform, right? It can inform the medicines that we have access to, the healthcare that we have access to. I see media and pop culture, yes. Women's rights, who has access to writing history? Right? The power of the pen, that's incredibly important. Maternal mortality, yep. Ability to own businesses, yep. Homes, entrepreneurship, education, public health, access to healthy food. You know, given what's happening with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a lot of these inequities revealed. So this is something that I think hopefully more folks are paying attention to. And, you know, given how many folks just wanted to join this conversation today, that leads me to believe we have an understanding that something is wrong and that we have to change it. Who are we studying? Yes, just walking down the street, sidewalks are a great place for us to kind of expand some of our consciousness in terms of racial profiling, right? And systemic racism. Which has roots in white supremacy. Day-to-day activities, absolutely. It's very interwoven. Environmental, banking, financial security, y'all are on it. Yep, absolutely. So this list, I mean, we could have a whole weekend retreat just talking about systemic racism and its intersection. But we cannot have a conversation about allyship and advocacy without bringing this to the table. Because these are your entry points. Right, all of the pieces that you're putting in your chat, the items that are, or the environments that are listed here, the efforts, the causes, the issues, these are your open doors. Pick from this list, start there. So as we talk about allyship, I like to think that most folks came with really good intentions. The intent to learn, the intent to be curious, the intent to fill in gaps, the intent to unlearn. However, one of the most critical things that we need to pay attention to when we're trying to be an ally, when we're trying to be an advocate, is the impact that our actions, our efforts, our language has on others. Unfortunately, it's nothing we have control over, right? Because every single person on this call is coming with very, very different lived experiences, right? So different words are going to impact us all differently. Different actions are going to impact us all differently. But just because we have really good intentions does not mean that it immediately equals our impact. And so how often do we have conversations centered around allyship and advocacy where we hear someone say, well, that's not what I meant, so you can't take it that way. And that is incredibly problematic, because the point of effective allyship is when we pay most attention to our impact. Pay the most attention. So what is an ally? some of the pieces in this definition that I really want to pull out is an ally is someone who is active, right? And we're seeing a lot of that activity right now, particularly around the protests surrounding George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery's and even Maurice Gordon's death. But what we need to happen is we need consistency. We need to all come back together 4 weeks from now, 8 weeks from now, 6 months from now, and continue this conversation, continue to critically think about how we're engaging, continue to critically think about our language, because we all grew up in very different worlds and learned probably a lot of problematic things, right? So another component of being an effective ally is that constant unlearning. So not only the consistency and the constant engagement, but the constant unlearning. Two, try to be an ally or an advocate. Just immediately, first thing, identifies that you have some element of privilege, whether it be through your job, whether it be through your race, whether it be through your gender, your religious or spiritual affiliation. There are all sorts of things that are interconnected in terms of what you have access to, what you have power in. I might even argue that if you're an extrovert, this movement is a place of privilege for you, right? To be loud, to be visible, to be out there. And the most critical part of being an ally is to work in solidarity with marginalized groups. And so one of the reasons that I bring that up is because there are a lot of things that an ally is not. And I mean, how many folks on this call are familiar with the term white savior? Just give me like a thumbs up, a hand. Right. White savior is directly connected to allies with great intentions who are maybe not paying enough attention to their impact. Right, which is why we had to bring that up before we even started this conversation, because it's focusing on our impact, focusing on our words, our actions, and how other folks around us are responding. That is the critical work. And usually the most uncomfortable and usually the most painful, because if we're not aware of how our words impact others, then we could potentially be causing more harm than good. So an ally is not someone who saves and not someone who helps, which can be a challenging thing to unlearn, particularly because of how deeply rooted we are in religious faith and spiritual thinking, right? There's that element of like being a servant for. So I challenge that narrative just a little bit in terms of, standing in solidarity with or alongside, right? If you think about us all standing in a line based on your privilege and how you want to be an ally, particularly for the Black community today, are you standing in front? Like, is that the place of helping? Or are you standing alongside or even behind? And so that is some critical work. If you're questioning right now whether or not you are a savior in terms of your allyship, spend some more time with that. Get to know what allyship looks like, particularly for the Black community and communities of color. Allyship is not a performance. And this is a tricky one because with movements, right, with the momentum, it can cause a lot of people to show up. If we look at the protests that are happening all across the country, the numbers are huge, right? But there are folks who are going to take photos, right, to appear more like socially conscious, to check a box, to put it on their resume, that there are some good intentions, right? Because there took some effort was made to engage, right? Some vulnerability was tapped into to show up. But allies, true allies, effective allies cannot stay there for long. So go, be a part of protests, write articles, do all of the things that call to you and your spirit and how you engage. But if folks are coming just for a protest, and like I mentioned, 6 weeks from now, we're not still continuing on with this conversation, see if you kind of fall in that circle. of performative allyship, because that can be a really dangerous and toxic place to stay in, particularly for the communities that you're trying to support. Allyship is not a learning opportunity. And I don't mean this, that like you shouldn't go learn. Please go learn all the things, read all the things. But I mean that allyship is not a learning opportunity in the way that we shouldn't be tokenizing the folks around us or the folks that are close enough to us, right? Some folks have pre-established relationships, particularly, folks of multiple different races that are friends. Right, there could be a closeness there where talking about race and processing through things is a norm. But if that is not your norm in your friend circles or with your colleagues, beware. Because there is a lot of fatigue that comes with, being a part of a marginalized community. And so when you have an ally approach those communities, or folks in those communities, asking how they can help, right? When someone's in pain, when someone's grieving, when someone's struggling, that's continuing to add the burden versus trying to be an ally, working for change to be more inclusive. So, when we think about what's happening right now, particularly with white folks or white passing folks, talk with your own circles. Learn with your own circles, right? We need to be taking on a lot of this educational burden instead of placing that on folks around us. So, thinking about allyship and where do we start? We start with the circles that we're closest to, the spaces that we're closest to, our spheres of influence is what I like to call them, right? These are parents, siblings, cousins, best friends, classmates, coworkers. Think about the humans that you interact with on like a day-to-day basis or a weekly basis. That's where you start. It can feel really overwhelming to be under the impression that you have to go and, dismantle the prison system today, which, long-term goals. But, think about like, who can you start having these conversations with today, right? Talking about race may be very normal for a lot of folks on this call. If it's not normal for you, how can you make it normal? So we sent out a survey before we had this conversation, just asking folks for some questions that they might have centered around allyship, advocacy, and racial justice. So I just very quickly wanted to ask folks, out of some of the questions that you see here on the screen, what do you want me to talk about? What do you want me to address? So for folks that aren't able to see the screen, one question is, what if I make a mistake? Another question is, how do I respond to defensiveness? Another question is, what do I say if I witness a racial microaggression? The next is, where can I process my guilt? Another is, how do I know if I'm being a savior? And then the last is, how do I have conversations about race at work, in my place of worship, that's a slip, in my place of worship, or at home? Okay. So we have a few folks that want to know about microaggressions. Yes. Okay. Defensiveness. All right. So the two that we're going to pick are defensiveness and microaggressions. Would love for you to address them all. Well, we can circle back. I just want to make sure we get to the end of this because we've got some really good stuff for you all.
Now, remember, we have the after show afterwards.
Yeah. I can pull this back up, but just for the 148 of us that are here, it's helpful to know kind of what feels important to you. All right. So how to respond to defensiveness. This is a practice. So unfortunately, I cannot offer you like a prescription for how to respond. It's going to take time. You're definitely going to mess up when you have conversations. Okay, give me an environment. When we think about defensiveness, someone put in the chat, where is this defensiveness coming from? Who is it coming from?
Or if you pose the question, raise your hand. So if you want to, we can unmute you and you can provide us.
Ooh, here we go. I got one. This is great. Thank you, Deborah. Okay, so how do I respond to defensiveness in the context of a coworker at a large meeting? So there's power dynamics in there. Okay, large-ish, 20 people. Yeah, so say, okay, we're in a committee meeting. Yeah. And maybe there is, maybe someone commits a microaggression. Let's say someone says, oh, so I'll give you some identifiers. So a white female who's leading the committee, just heard from a Black male colleague about an idea that he had. And so the leader of the committee says, oh, you just did such a great job. You were so articulate about your idea, and thank you so much, right? There's like a microaggression sandwiched into that compliment. So say that happens at a meeting. And one of the ways that I might recommend a bystander intervening, right, an ally and an advocate for that colleague who is just microaggressed, is to ask that person, what do you mean by articulate? Right? Like strategically ask questions back to be able to have that person who's leading the committee kind of get to the depth of what they were trying to say. And then what I would do personally, if it was me, is I would go up to the leader of that committee after the fact, talk to them about microaggressions, ask if they know anything, right? We need to share what we're learning. So if you're aware that that is a microaggression, maybe they are not. Maybe they had no idea, right? And that's where unconscious bias can come in. So making the assumption that just because someone's a leader of a committee and that they have the understanding of what they just did and how much harm they potentially just caused. Yeah, so that would be one way I would respond. The other way I would respond is if you have a relationship with a coworker who is microaggressed, check in on them after the fact, right? Maybe not necessarily in the big setting, right? Because nobody really wants that much attention called to them in a moment. Well, let's see. Joe, do you have other thoughts? I tried to take the two together, and it wasn't as helpful.
So I love these examples in particular because we probably have all been a part of some situation or been, unfortunately, been the recipient of that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think particularly it depends on your relationships in that space. Again, there are power dynamics in place. So if your boss is up there, how do you address your boss microaggressing, having some bias incidences that occur? Mm-hmm. And so how do you address that? So one of the things that I would do is there needs to be at least an opportunity to address it in private. I think for that person to kind of educate and provide. Again, it depends on your relationship. If you're in a meeting and you all know each other and you're very familiar, just being able to at least, I know people have used kind of humor. I'm not a big proponent of humor because I think there's a lot to be missed there. But I have been in situations where people actually say, well, that sounds like a microaggression, right? Especially if you've had trainings with the team and this is part of your system. I think this is a very direct and covert way of actually calling in and calling out people, right? Mm-hmm. So if you all have the same language, if you have a game plan, you can actually address these things sometimes in real time because you all have the same language and understanding that the workplace must have these components in order for it to be inclusive, to be sensitive to people, and so on and so forth. So again, we could play with the scenario left and right, but I think that as you start to think about your systems and the current situation in which you work with in your workplace, how can we be proactive in providing people language that they can typically use? Mm-hmm. Someone just wrote down, breaking through the norms, using language like ouch. Again, you would have to have some precursors because saying ouch may not mean anything to someone. But if someone is actually going through an experience or a training, they'll know exactly what that is, right? So,
can I pause you
sure.
real quick? We had a question about referring to a Black identified person as articulate and why that's a microaggression.
So
setting the stage, I realized I didn't do that.
Thank you. So I think in that particular microaggression, there's historically there has been some connection to intelligence and capacity and just and not being equal to maybe a majority, maybe someone who might be white or white passing. Mm-hmm. So those are some things that folks need to be mindful of. Language and words can really be a tool and a weapon, whether it's used intentionally or unintentionally. And so this is a straight form of it, right? So, I've seen this happen before in my own workplace or even in my personal relationships. People have said, well, you're not like those Latinos. And so to be able to ask questions about what do you mean by that, or repeat and paraphrase, which we'll get to in a minute, will actually reset the conversation so that they can hear what they said and the impact behind that. Because now you have them, you grasping them.
Yeah. Well, and I might argue, like, I know that in that scenario, there are many layers. And so, one-on-one conversations and dialogue after the fact can definitely provide opportunity for more vulnerability. That individual could identify that they've made a mistake. But I do think that there's also value in someone within that space, like in that 20-person meeting, speaking up as well. Because kind of what was just demonstrated, right, is that, like, I made the assumption that folks on this call understood what a problem it was to say that a Black identified person is articulate, right? And so, like, even if we believe that we are all in a certain place, making that assumption can also hinder our movement forward. So, it's a delicate balance between power, authority, language, right? Also thinking back to, like, extroversion and introversion. Like, if you're in a committee with 20 people and you're an introverted person, that is not the space to, engage and be brave. And so then maybe one-on-one is the way for you. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, other folks are putting other microaggression examples in the chat. Absolutely. We could have a whole session.
So we will in the next probably about 5-10 minutes, because we want to make sure that you have a voice in this conversation instead of just us talking to you. So we're going to keep it.
Yeah. So transitioning into more action, I'm going to toss it back to Joe.
Awesome. So we're going to talk a little about what advocacy looks like, right? So this looks at how you get involved in an actionable way, right? Advocacy utilizes tools and tactics to coalition building, organizing, even gathering research and data, understanding power dynamics, using your spheres of influence, and obviously for the cause of dismantling structures, particularly those who are disenfranchised or even in oppressed communities. So I often think about, particularly the allyship and advocacy, they're a true example of, or probably the most efficient way, is that you're looking at it from a very social justice lens, right? So you're supporting folks, all people, to find equity, to find justice in that, in the push for equity, find a justice within that. So that could mean a whole different ways, from policy making to review of programs, things like that, or even whether or not a particular neighborhood is redlined. Someone said, right? Like, how do you actively go in there? Advocacy is sometimes a little bit more of, you have to consider, what are you sacrificing in some regard, depending upon. So as you can see, some folks are out there in the uprisings and the rebellions, and some people are advocating for Black folks in particular, about Black lives and the incidents that happen. So how do I show up in advocacy? Sometimes advocacy can actually be in the rooms in which you have power, and so how do you dismantle some of the structures that aren't necessarily serving oppressed communities? So that's kind of like the framework of advocacy. It goes a little bit deeper than just being supportive or being involved. It's a little bit more of the actionable pieces.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even the risk associated with different action, which is
Right.
why the intentional reflection is so important. Is like, what are you willing to risk?
Yeah. And so that risk assessment, it varies depending upon where you are and your environment. So at work, it could be relationships with coworkers. It could be the fact that your boss microaggressed, right? And even bringing that up, what are the challenges with that? What is it that you have to basically contend with? Mm-hmm. So we're going to move on to the next part, racial justice. So again, it's a proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and overall outcomes for all. So again, this whole justice, social justice lens is so imperative in the work that you do. You're looking for all. Not when we're talking about this particular incident where people are saying Black Lives Matter, we're really honing and pinpointing down what exactly is happening. We're talking about police reform, we're talking about violence, we're talking about systemic issues. Mm-hmm. So, racial justice can look at, you yourself kind of stopping and reflecting on what exactly is happening. The continued violence, the continued policies and approaches, what is going on, how do you define it, how do you educate and talk to people? That is huge. Oh, yeah. Education, and we'll talk more about this in the next slide, is something that sometimes is personal and also something that can be communal. We talk about collectivism in that approach. Dismantle, fight. I can go on and on. I'm going to pick a couple of these, but I want to really reiterate the need to learn history, the need to go back. And you don't have to go too far back. I mean, this particular situation with police violence and deaths toward Black folks has been documented in the past. I mean, Freddie Gray, what happened? How would we advance the conversation? Mm-hmm. So, you can donate, you can volunteer. I know in the world of COVID, it's a little bit more difficult, but there are so many ways that you can do. You can be a part of this racial justice dialogue or even engagement. Voting is huge, as you all know. When the election season about 3 years ago came about, our students were out there and they were affected. And there's a lot of things that have occurred and things that have affected marginalized communities. So these are things that you can do. Call out and call in when appropriate in your spaces, speak up, step back, knowing where exactly, as Emily alluded to, where your power is and how much are you actually putting yourself too far up front, where you're taking voices away or you're not elevating other people who are just as important within the struggle, particularly Black folks. Mm-hmm. So, as I think about Freddie Gray and I think about what exactly happened about 4 years ago, how did you show up? How did we show up as a community for our Hopkins students and also the Baltimore community? It was so close. So to think about, now we're at an interesting time with everything happening, politics, we're thinking about COVID, and these affected communities are being directly marginalized. They're being affected. Our Black folks are being affected directly. So what's different this time around? What are you going to do to make sure that your workspace, your personal life, and the things that matter to you are somehow going to allow you to make some changes? And so the next slide real quick, because I know we're running out of time. I want you to sit and think about how you would show up. And again, here, advocacy and action, I wanted to let you know that this is just our list. This is not the whole list. We are going to make sure that whatever you put in your chat, we're going to make sure that we infuse this as a working document. We're going to share it with you. Mm-hmm. But I want to think about your home, yourself, thinking about your self-reflection. Therapy is great. Journaling, we talk about particularly how does racial trauma affect us, right? And it also affects the community at large. We put questioning tradition in all of these just to kind of give you a quick, and I think questioning traditions allow you also to think about power constructs, think about the system that you currently are working in, and how exactly are you going to dismantle some of these propped up things that further marginalize people. Again, we can go down the list, but I really want to make sure that you all understand that the education piece is so vital. Pick up a book, pick up many books actually. I also, if you don't like reading, I love reading, as you can tell. But there are podcasts that people are putting out there. One particular one that I enjoy is Code Switch. They only talk about race. They talk about the intersections of race. And so thinking about those things, we're going to provide you with some worksheets. There's opinion articles. When you think about your work, which most of you are probably thinking about, what are your resources, right? When something does happen, do you actually know where to go? Are you well versed in kind of making sure that you're propping up, that you're actually articulating to everyone about what their what their options are, in particular if something does happen. We want to be able to be empowering agents in that regard, and then continue to push people to do some workshops. Long-term strategies, you got to look at your policies, you got to look at your curriculum, you got to look at how your program reviews. What is it that we're missing? How are we missing a swath of folks who need support? Talk about wellness practices, right? Normalize racial justice dialogue in staff meetings. I cannot stress that enough. I think one of the most important things is if you dismantle the normative, then you can actually make room for the things that matter for your team, and especially the identities they carry. So those are some big pieces. As far as education, I will point you directly. We've had a critical race theory session. And so look up critical race theory, particularly identity development. Each of our race and ethnic groups have been studied for years. They need to be studied now, particularly with intersections. And so, get yourself well educated around those pieces, read articles. Again, the sharing circles that we did, the office hours with themed topics, we're actually going to be pushing that forward. And then when you think about your community, how are you engaging that? You got to know your local history. There's a lot in Baltimore in particular that we are not privy to. I'm always astounded at the things that have been pushed out. Communities, whole communities gone. And so to really dive deep into that, those are some possible ways. Demonstrations, we know that those are happening. And then I want to stress this piece. I think that showing up when it's done in emergency speaks volumes. I think one of the issues there is that we don't necessarily know how to be proactive. And I think if you create systems or you create protocols and procedures to be able to confront those things as they happen, those are some important ways in which you can be proactive. Again, share what you learn. Don't just take it in, don't absorb, but at the same time, figure the space out. Nobody wants to hear or know it all, so to speak, but you want to engage again in these communities in which you may not be a part of, to make sure that you engage authentically. You're self-assessing, why you're there, what's the motivation for it. So those are a few pieces. If you have any others, I would love for you all to make sure that you put those in the chat. We're going to make sure that we pull these resources together. And we're going to basically have an open conversation at this point. We'd love to hear from you. What were some things that stuck with you? Maybe some things we missed. Again, this is only an hour. We want to take the next 15 minutes to really engage and not just answer questions, but have a dialogue with each other about it. So if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, we'd love to take some questions so that we can unmute you and then have a conversation around that.
And we'll also be willing to stay later. So
yes,
if there are any questions, we can hang around. And as for the great resources that were kind of brought up and suggested in the chat, this link down here for you to submit your questions. So even after we leave today's dialogue, that's going to be a link that we're going to leave open for a while. So as we move through this process together, if you have specific questions or even come across resources that you would really love for like the Hopkins community to have some access to, that will be kind of the central place. And then we'll continue to share those things out because, like we said, this is not going to it's not going to be over when we leave here. We got to.
I would like to say one last thing real quick, Emily, before we open it up. Please participate. So raise your hand in the function. But I wanted to say that, you do have resources on campus that are directly in line with the job descriptions of what we do. But this is by no means should be just falling on the shoulders of those folks. We love it, but it can be just as tiring for us as well. And so we need you to help us out. And we also want you to be allies in this work. And so we see this is particularly this diversity and inclusion and equity as a campus-wide responsibility for all of us. It only amplifies and makes our campuses better. It makes us do our work better, and it keeps us responsible. So anyway, so here we go.
Okay, so the first question, how do you talk to your parents who can't or won't see past riots and protests to get to the bigger issue? Woo, family.
Wow.
And that's where we should start, right? Like, having these conversations are what will help us. I don't want to say practice, because it's important to even have them, but there will be more comfortability in engaging in these conversations with coworkers, new friends, and the like if we start where we are. So parents, siblings, cousins, close friends, like, go for it. I would say, so how do you talk to parents who can't or won't see past the riots and protests? From what I'm reading behind that is, you want them to see the bigger issue, which is great. So how could you start? So empathy is, try to find a way in through empathy, particularly with when I have conversations with my parents. Something that I like to bring up is how it's affected me. I guess this is with the assumption that they care about me, and I'm hoping so. But from that angle, and like how everything that's happening in the community is affecting me and what I'm worried about, that may be a way in for your parents to kind of potentially become allies for self-interest, right? Like, if they're going to start by advocating for you and feeling empowered to engage because they're doing it for you, like, that could potentially be a way in. There will also be people who will just never want to participate and never want to engage, right? And so sometimes we have to kind of make peace with, like, when we have these conversations, you're going to share your viewpoint, they're going to share theirs, and then they're just, you have to make actions otherwise, other places. Because while we want to shift all perspective, it's best to start with the folks that are kind of eager and ready, right? Like, I'm thinking of the 140 plus that are on this call. Like, we may not all feel prepared to engage, but we showed up, right? And organizing 101 is, you recruit the folks that are already kind of interested, prepare them with the tools that they need to engage, and then continue engaging. And it can be a ripple effect from there. So parents can be a tough one, particularly just having these conversations from an intergenerational lens. There are going to be things that we experience that our parents will never understand, and there are things that our parents have experienced that we will never understand. So yeah, Joe, do you have anything?
Yeah, I actually, so I have strategies and interventions that you all could use, and I use them often. And part of it is because I've had to be around those tables during Thanksgiving, Easter, and we don't like everyone in our family, but we got to deal with them. And then we also have, we might be in situations where we might have coworkers, or maybe that we might have to kind of, think about our relationship. So one of the possible strategies, obviously I talked a little bit about this, about paraphrasing or repeating back what they said so they can hear what exactly is being interpreted, or even how it's being impacted by you. I always like to ask people for more information. You get them to talk, get them to kind of, continue the dialogue, so that they can kind of start to see, whether or not they see the holes in their argument, or maybe they might just say, well, that's fake news. Some of the students said that yesterday. How do you deal with someone to say that? Also, the part that we always we always leave out is the emotional piece. And I think that's just as powerful. So to be able to challenge the stereotype and talk about it, express your feelings, I think is just as important. Someone's told me that I'm not like those other Latino folks. And just to be able to say to them, well, they are my people as well. Mexicans, Ecuadorians, I'm Puerto Rican. And so we are, I feel a lot of their pain and I understand what's going on. I have privileges around my citizenship, my maleness, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of intersecting of identities. The one way that I'd like to interject and actually approach some of these things is I ask people, or I have conversations about people's identities and their value systems. So as I talk about it, I say to them, well, tell me about what is it like to be Christian, or how's it like to be of a certain faith, or even if you're part of a group or an organization that is maybe philanthropic, or they're about helping other folks, and or even just personal values, right? Just how you live your life and what's most important to you. Oftentimes than not, you'll probably get the same answers that actually will help them see other ways in which they need to be a little bit more informative about the topic, and also be more sensitive that one size does not fit all situation, to be able to have those conversations. Values and principles are huge for people, especially folks who are in a dominant culture. And so you hear that all the time in the news. And so, as we start to engage, we need to start asking, are those really true values and principles that you hold so dearly? And if so, how does this relate to the equity of treatment of oppressed groups? So, and then again, you might have some folks who may not value diversity or inclusion. That your fight is your fight, and you can take it but so far. But I think that again, this is a long game and it's not short. You have to really make sure as you engage some of this work that you're continuously seeing it that way. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think I've given you a couple of strategies in which that could be helpful.
So we have some really, really good questions. I'm going to pick the two that are Hopkins specific, and then we'll carry over into our extended time with some that are more strategy. So one of the questions was how to respond when students ask about Hopkins institutionalized racism and the history of Hopkins in Baltimore, and what that conversation looks like. How do you acknowledge it? How do you talk about it? And not having been at Hopkins for very long, I will offer my brief opinion. There is power in naming it, because oftentimes when we don't name our history, that's how we reinforce supremacist systems. So, while you can't change the past, and it may cause folks a lot of pain and anguish to bring up and acknowledge, right? And particularly being in such a big institution, there are other potential consequences and ramifications. But when you thinking about your question and engaging with students, naming it is incredibly important and necessary. Okay, so the second question about Hopkins is struggling to balance personal beliefs with the perceived expectation of your role as an agent of the university. And
it's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a tough one.
It is huge.
I think again, it has to go back to your manager and having conversations about the expectations and approaches in which you can support students. So a few years ago, during the Freddie Gray, we had a demonstration with students. We supported them just by being there physically, walking them down to the convening of the rally, just being able to be a part of that. Those are sticky things, but I think as long as you have a clear line and conversation with the expectations of how far you can straddle it. And again, I know that there's some systemic history, particularly around marginalized people and people of color, particularly Black communities and Hopkins and that connection. Again, I think if I can be frank, I think one of the best things about engaging in some of that work is to be able to say and call out even those facts, right? Like those things have been reported, those things are out there, and to educate our students, to educate each other is so important. So whether it's Henrietta Lacks, or even currently, you know, what's happening with our students, right? Mm-hmm. And so just be able to really connect with the story and the storytelling. And if it connects with your personal beliefs and your, you know, job security, those are conversations that I think need to be had with your manager, and at large the university. And I think we have protocols and procedures in which, you know, certain offices can help support or even be a part of supporting our students in particular.
Well, and Joe, going back to something that you mentioned earlier about allyship and advocacy, and it's almost like the assessment of the risk and like how far you're willing to go, right? Like when we're conflicted in terms of balancing who we're expected to be and who we are, those are sometimes much bigger decisions than just, you know, your day to day. You know, what communities do you want to engage in? Where can you fill up in other spaces? And so that just kind of stuck with me in your response. So we're 3 minutes away from 3:00 Eastern Standard Time. We still have some questions in the chat related to defensiveness, related to having family members that are in the law enforcement and military, you know, questions about the student experience, and a few more. So Joe and I will stay on the call until just before 3:30. So if you're willing to stay or want to kind of just listen in on the conversation, please feel willing to do so. But should you have to leave us now, I really want to thank you all for participating and engaging with us. And again, the link that's up on the screen right now, that is going to be an open-ended form that I personally will check daily. You know, to be able to help guide you through some of your allyship and advocacy dilemmas, to be able to provide resources. Also, if you want to be an advocate and share some of the resources that you've all enjoyed, please include them there too, because then we can share them out to your peers and the folks that joined us.
And the next phase of this is we're going to open it up for you all to speak with each other. So just FYI, we were taking precautions because there have been some incidences with Zoom, and so we just want to be, you know, protect our folks. So, but we're going to open it up for you all to actually have a conversation in the space.
Yeah, and there will be a 2.0.
Yes.
So we'll continue to move through this conversation gradually in more depth. So be on the lookout for that. Okay, so as far as questions that remain, some folks wanted me to touch base on the defensiveness question in the beginning. So I'm actually going to go back to this slide. So the question was, how do I respond to defensiveness, particularly when thinking about family members or coworkers? So in my opinion, defensiveness comes from a place of insecurity and pain, right? It's a very human reaction. So like when our amygdala is hijacked, when we're feeling like we're in a stressful situation, it's almost like the smoke detector for our body. And so all rational, logical decision-making goes away. And it's like that almost like knee-jerk reaction, which is where I think some of the defensiveness can be rooted in, right? So that's kind of a muscle memory move for defensiveness, but chances are there are many layers beneath that. And so I would encourage you that if you feel that someone's getting defensive, one, don't get defensive back. It's very difficult not to do sometimes, right? Especially if you're fighting for your honor or, you know, advocating for a community that you feel very passionate about. But try not to get defensive. You can acknowledge that, like, you sense that this is a stressful or a frustrating thing to talk about, and ask them more about why. right? Help guide them through the process of uncovering why this may feel like a tense topic, because something like this actually happened. I had a conversation with my mom a few days ago about the protests, and I saw her getting very defensive, right? There are visible cues, like there are tone and pitch cues. A lot can tell us that it's headed that direction. But one of the things I did is I asked her just kind of to explain where that like heat was coming from. And in turn, she shared a story with me about her childhood that shaped the way that she's viewing things today. Right. And that can be a release in some way. So defensiveness, it also depends, right? If it's your boss, if there are power dynamics, so I bring up the example with a family member, but I have a good relationship with that family member. Not everyone does. Okay.
And Emily speaks to a very interesting piece, right? So everyone has their own story. And even in those stories, we can see those intersecting identities influencing each other. And so to be able to, have like a 10,000 foot view or even a close up view to be able to even love someone who may or may not share some of your values, right? And how do you engage that work is literally to ask them about their history, ask them about, their processing.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I've had friends who have family members who have taken 20, 30 years to be accepting of, and to want to learn more. So those are some things that are on the horizon, I think, particularly since a lot of our generational cross-sectioning is becoming a little more condensed. Mm-hmm. We're becoming a little bit more connected than we would like to, I think, at this point in time. But I think it raises questions about how, I think there's a space for learning about folks, but also there's a space for us to take action and to ask for what we need, what we want, particularly if you are an oppressed group. Those are things that we have to kind of skillfully maneuver and allow. Now, are people able to raise their hands?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So if you wanted to, I tried it myself. So if you wanted to raise your hand and wanted to say something, we definitely would love to hear from you. Mm-hmm. This feels like a podcast in itself. Maybe we should. We're recording it, but maybe we should just post it somewhere.
So someone, I don't know if they are still on the chat. Someone had said that it feels especially challenging for them to engage with family members that are in law enforcement in the military. And I don't have any more context than that, right? So I don't know if the challenge is because of their day-to-day work or if it's a challenge because of their belief systems or what they value. But that can be a complicated conversation to have, particularly if someone works in a position that might have like collective values that are really detrimental to larger populations. And so if that person's on the call, I'd love to know just a little bit more about why that feels challenging, so that maybe I can kind of offer some guidance on moving forward.
I think there's also something to be said about, and I'm just going to briefly, I think this is a 2.0 conversation, but when we start to talk about and legitimize citizenship and Americanisms and what does that look like, and who has the rights to those, right? So I only bring those up because I think that sometimes we converge some of these pieces, again, intersecting identity. So if you're part of the military and, and folks are kneeling, that's an affront to the flag, right? And so those are some things that are in dialogue and in conversation. And however you fall into that specific topic, I think the question should be asked is, looking at the values, right, and looking at what is at stake here. We just saw NASCAR,